Hello YouTube! In this video I want to explore the question of the value of true belief. I'm drawing in particular on an interesting article by Philip Kitcher, Truth or Consequences. Kitcher begins by citing what he calls Huxley's Credo. This comes from Thomas Huxley, the 19th century biologist and critic of theism. After one of Huxley's children died, he was understandably pretty depressed, and he once wrote that he could imagine being asked, okay, what was the benefit? What was the benefit of rejecting Christianity and thereby denying yourself a source of hope and comfort that so many people find in it when their loved ones die? And his answer to this was, well, because I care about the truth. Or as Huxley put it, truth is better than much profit. Kitcher calls this Huxley's Credo. So even if you would be comforted by the idea of an afterlife, you're better off not believing in it, if it is in fact the case that the afterlife does not exist. Huxley's Credo can be stated a bit more formally like this. This is how Kitcher puts it. For any true proposition and any person, a state in which the person believes that proposition is superior to the closest possible state in which the person does not believe that proposition. Kitcher calls those who endorse the Credo Gnostics. Gnostics place a great value on true belief and knowledge. True belief is worthwhile even if it comes at a great cost to our happiness. Those who reject the Credo, Kitcher calls romantics. The romantics are sceptical of the value of true belief. A romantic need not claim that true belief is never valuable, of course. That would be a pretty ridiculous proposition. But they deny that all our other goals, all our other values should be subordinated to true belief. A romantic will take seriously the idea that Huxley was worse off as a result of rejecting the false belief in the afterlife. And it's not difficult to see the romantic's basic point. Huxley would have been happier if he had believed in an afterlife. It doesn't seem that this belief would have had any obvious negative consequences. Indeed, there would have been some indirect positive consequences. Without the period of despair, Huxley would have been able to continue his work unabated. He would have been more productive. He would have maintained stronger relationships with the rest of his friends and family. So there's at least some reason to take the romantic seriously here. So another preliminary point. Romantics need not argue that if you hold some true belief, and if this belief is causing you distress or otherwise interfering with your goals, then you should give up that belief. Beliefs are not under direct voluntary control, right? We can make the judgment that Huxley would have been better off with a false belief in the afterlife, without holding that Huxley ought to have actually adopted such a belief. He may not have been capable of adopting a belief in an afterlife, given his other beliefs and commitments, because you can't just choose what to believe. At least not in any, it's not easy to choose what to believe. At least it's not, can't just be done like snapping your fingers. So our question here is simply about the value of true belief. Now, I think there are a lot of people who fairly uncritically accept Huxley's Credo. Once it's stated, I think you can see it underlying a lot of arguments, both in everyday life and in philosophy. When a person says that they believe in God because this brings them comfort or gives their life a purpose or something like that, it's tempting to respond, yeah, but whether the belief is comforting, whether a belief gives your life a purpose, that has nothing to do with whether or not it's true. There are plenty of unpleasant truths. Yes, that's quite right. But we seem to be assuming Huxley's Credo here. We're assuming that the truth is what matters. But, what if we reject the kind of all-encompassing value of truth? Or what if we take it that there are other things we value that may be in tension with truth? In that case, much more would need to be said in response to the person who says that, one reason why I believe this is because it brings me comfort. As it turns out, Huxley's Credo does face various counterexamples, which are quite well known in philosophy. So here are three major counterexamples, or at least claimed counterexamples, to Huxley's Credo. First, people may use truths for destructive ends. Consider a group of terrorists discovering a way to manufacture a deadly disease. Surely, we might think, a state in which the terrorist believes the true proposition is far worse to the closest possible state in which they don't. It would be much better if terrorists did not know how to manufacture deadly contagious diseases. Now, I think there's a pretty plausible response on this point from the defender of Huxley's Credo. In stating that true belief is better, we need to ask, better for who? And the natural answer is, it's better for the one who holds the belief. And this straightforwardly accommodates the terrorist case, because from the point of view of the terrorists, it surely is better to have a true belief. The true belief about how to manufacture the disease will allow them to more easily achieve their goals. The consequences are bad for the rest of us, of course, but it's not at all obvious that holding the true belief negatively affects the terrorists' well-being. Indeed, part of the reason why we want the terrorist to have a false belief here is because we recognise that the false belief will be a hindrance to the terrorist. So actually, this example seems to work only on the assumption that truth is valuable. And I mean, this case does emphasise an important point as well. We can endorse Huxley's Credo, right? We can endorse the claim that truth is better than much profit, while still holding that there are circumstances where it would be better to withhold certain truths from the public. Something like that. Okay, second, there is the problem of trivial truths. There are a variety of facts which are completely uninteresting and irrelevant to anything we care about. For example, there is a fact about the number of hairs on my left arm. Would I be better off knowing the exact number of hairs on my left arm? Many philosophers have thought that I just don't gain anything from believing the truth about this. So the Credo says that for any true proposition, a state in which I believe that proposition is superior to the state in which I don't. So, let's just add the true proposition about the number of hairs on my left arm to my stock of beliefs, right? Does that make me better off? Well, a lot of people would say no, that doesn't improve anything because it's just trivial. It's not important. So I must say I don't really share the intuitions of most philosophers on this particular point. I think that these so-called trivial truths, I mean, to me it seems pretty plausible to say that they actually are valuable. It's just that they have very little value relative to many of the truths we tend to care about. The reason why it seems odd to say that trivial truths are valuable is, I think, just due to the finitude of the human mind and the imperfection of our epistemic resources. Discovering the truth of any given matter requires us to expend effort and requires us to devote our limited cognitive space to the discovery. And as a result of this, we need to make judgments about which truths are worth discovering. There are many facts in the world that we're just not interested in, so it makes very little sense to put in the effort that would be required to discover them when we could work on discovering interesting things instead. But just imagine this case, what if it required no effort at all to uncover any truth? What if our minds were not limited so that we could hold an infinite number of true propositions? What if we were godlike beings who could just direct our attention to something and then learn the truth about it? Well, in that case, I mean, my feeling is, why not learn exactly how many hairs are on my left arm? That is something that actually I would like to know. I mean, I'm just speaking for myself here, but I actually do get the attraction to the truth just for its own sake. I'd like to know the truth. There's a part of me, at least, that would like to know the truth just for the sake of the truth. And yes, the number of hairs on my left arm is not a particularly important truth, but if I could learn that fact without expending any effort, then I would do so. So, while some truths are relatively unimportant, I'm not inclined to accept that there are any that are completely trivial. But let me make maybe a more general argument here. So, we all grant that some truths are more valuable than other truths. Knowing the fundamental laws of the universe, that's a really significant truth. Similarly, of significance, though for different reasons, would be knowing, for instance, that the people I love also love me. So knowing facts about one's close personal relationships, that's important to us. We want to know the truth there. And then on the other side, there's something like knowing the times of high tide. For me, that's really of very little significance. I don't particularly care when it's high tide or low tide. There are very few contexts in which I need this information, though I suppose it does come up occasionally. I live by the sea. Maybe I one day desire to go down to the rock pools, but I know that these are underwater at high tide. So, in that kind of context, useful to have that information. Or maybe somebody will ask me when it's high tide, and it would be useful to know so that I can tell them. But the point is this: we can rank true beliefs in terms of their importance to us. Some truths are of great value, some of middling value, some of very little value. Now, the appeal to trivial truths involves the supposition that at some point we move from truths that are of very little value to truths that are of no value whatsoever. But why? I mean, we seem to be kind of going from a difference in degree to a sort of difference in kind here. It may well be that people value things in this way, but I wonder what the reason is. What would explain that difference, right? Why do we kind of jump to no value whatsoever rather than just less value? Okay, the issue of trivial truths and people using truths for destructive ends, maybe not so persuasive. The third problem for Huxley's Credo are the devastating truths. And I think these pose a much more serious difficulty. So the classic example is something like a 5-year-old child dying of a deadly disease, and you tell them some comforting lies. You don't believe in an afterlife, but you just pretend that there is. Or maybe you have somebody dress up as Santa Claus to come and visit them. So the child has a false belief that Santa Claus exists, but why would you deprive them of that if it brings them some happiness in their final days? It seems ridiculous to say that the child would be better off knowing the facts. And another example along these lines, consider people who are at risk of deadly heritable diseases that have no cure or prevention. Even if tests for the disease are available, they may choose not to know whether or not they have it. This is the case for people who are at risk of Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is something that will, it doesn't produce any symptoms until, say, the age of 40 or 50, but it's a pretty horrible death. It's a very unpleasant disease, and people who are at risk of this often judge that if they did have Huntington's and if they knew this fact, it would just psychologically incapacitate them, so they choose to remain in the dark rather than take the risk of uncovering a devastating truth. So if you can put it in terms of like the payoffs for their current well-being, where okay, if I have Huntington's and I believe I have Huntington's, so if I have the true belief that I have Huntington's, then my well-being is just going to collapse. If I have Huntington's and I don't know whether I have it, well, I'm going to be perfectly happy, right? At least for the time that I've got left, and so on. So you can see the rest there. In terms of my current well-being, if I haven't taken the test, then it makes no difference whether or not I've got Huntington's. Of course, I know there's a risk that I have it, and that will have a negative effect on me. So if I don't have Huntington's, then I would be better off knowing this. I would be better off with that true belief. But the risk is, well, if I do have Huntington's and I believe this, that's going to ruin the rest of the sort of good life that I've got left. That's the worst possible outcome. So what would we say to somebody who reasons in this kind of way? Well, there are obviously benefits to knowing that you have Huntington's. That will allow you to plan your life accordingly. It will allow you to inform others so that they are aware of your position. But, at this point, we're now just debating how to weigh up the payoffs. We're asking, do the benefits of knowing outweigh the cost? But there is a cost to the true belief. So, in principle, why shouldn't the cost outweigh the benefits? Once we grant that believing the truth has a cost, Huxley's Credo maybe starts to look somewhat implausible, perhaps. So anyway, in light of the three problems just noted here, Kitcher suggests reformulating Huxley's Credo as follows. He says, we should think of it this way. It is better that true belief be available in a society, provided the society is epistemically well run, that its members are strong and disposed to use their knowledge in morally permissible ways, and that the belief is significant. So, why exactly is it that knowing the truth about having Huntington's would be bad? Well, it's because Huntington's is bad, and because individuals may not be able to psychologically cope with the information. Ideally, what we want to do in this situation is prevent or cure Huntington's, right? What we want as a society is for nobody to have Huntington's. Similarly, why is it bad for everyone to have easy access to truths about how to manufacture diseases? Well, because some people will use those devices for destructive ends. Again, what we want to do about this is prevent people from having those kind of destructive goals. So a key point here is that one way of thinking about Huxley's Credo is that we can identify circumstances in which true belief would be bad and then work to remove those circumstances. So, yeah, true belief is good, but because of the imperfections in society, sometimes it has negative consequences. This should not change our attitude towards true belief. Rather, we should use this as grounds for attempting to change society. This is just what we do with Huntington's, or with the dying child, or with terrorists. We want to solve these problems so that we can bring everybody closer to a condition in which true belief would be a good thing. So under this interpretation, Gnostics are those who say that we should aim for truth, and this may involve creating social conditions in which everybody would benefit from truth. And Gnostics take it that this is achievable. In the same way that it seems like it might well be achievable to eliminate Huntington's. I mean, if we get to the point where we can manipulate genes and so on. I'm saying this, I'm actually not entirely sure exactly how Huntington's is caused, so I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but presumably it's in principle possible to make some kind of technological intervention that would cure or prevent it. So that's the idea then, is that these truths are only bad because we can't do that yet. So this is a more sophisticated form of Huxley's Credo. Truth is better than much profit, assuming we have dealt with problems such as terrorism and illness and so on. But the Romantic will continue to object here. The basic issue is this. There are certain truths that are subversive, that may challenge our worldview, our way of life, our basic goals. Why should all our other goals and all the other things we take to be valuable be subordinated to the goal of true belief? So the more sophisticated form of Huxley's Credo grants that there are contexts in which true belief would be bad, but then it prescribes altering the circumstances so that the true belief becomes good, right? So, okay, true belief about having Huntington's is bad, but the way that we deal with this is by trying to make sure that nobody ever has Huntington's. The Romantic doubts that this kind of thing will always be possible. And specifically, these are cases in which true belief threatens our fundamental values. And these are the subversive truths. So what might these subversive truths be? Well, there are plenty of examples of beliefs in the past that were, at the time they were proposed, thought to be subversive. Just take Galileo and Darwin, for instance. Of course, most of us no longer feel the force of these examples. We have all long lived in a disenchanted world, and we take the discoveries of people like Galileo and Darwin as being fundamental parts of our worldview rather than as radical challenges to it. So here are a few examples from Kitcher that I think have a bit more power, examples that threaten what we take to be important. So Kitcher asks us to imagine, how would we respond if we were to have reason to think that any of these things might be true? So, first of all, scientific racism, the view that there are genetic differences between races that fix limits to the abilities and temperaments of those races that have traditionally been marginalised, and no environmental changes will compensate for these differences. So suppose we were to discover that, in general, black people really do have lower IQ or really are more disposed to violence, where this is due to genetic differences, and so no matter how we alter the environments, they still will be cognitively inferior. Second, psychological egoism. What we think are propensities to kind kind of have altruistic feelings for other people, to have compassion for other people, sympathize with other people. Actually, right, all of that is just a product of kind of unconscious strategies for manipulating others. So that when you express any kind of compassion or sympathy, right, that's really just a manipulation tactic, let's say. And ultimately, all people are entirely self-interested and have no genuine concern for others whatsoever. Third, suppose we were to discover that stable human relationships are only possible where people believe elaborate myths about themselves. So this, I guess, might be connected actually to the second point about psychological egoism. It might be the case that in order to experience genuine love, you have to assume that you have concern for the other person, and so you're not entirely self-interested. And of course, there are other stories we could tell here. The point is that if this were to turn out to be true, then we would be forced directly to choose between the truth and our relationships, right? If it's true that stable human relationships are only possible when people believe myths about themselves, right, then you can either have the truth, you can either know that the myths are just myths, or you can have stable human relationships. A final example that I like, that Kitcher doesn't mention this, but I think it's pretty cool, is situationism in psychology. So suppose we were to discover that human behaviour is a product of seemingly irrelevant factors of the situation, and that nobody has anything resembling stable character traits. So if you see a passerby fall down on the street, whether or not you decide to help them is determined by factors such as whether there is a nice smell in the air. There is actually some evidence for situationism, which I won't go into here, but you can Google it if you're interested. Okay, so the point of all of these is not to argue that any of these are true. It's rather to ask how you would respond if they became live possibilities for you. I mean, if you thought that there might be a significant probability that they were true. I mean, hopefully at least one of these strikes you as disturbing, as challenging what you take to be a fundamental value. Obviously, some people might be quite happy with them, Like, yeah, there might be some people who just say, yep, situationism, that sounds fine. Psychological egoism, that's, whatever, doesn't bother me. But, hopefully you can imagine certain things that, if true, would challenge fundamental parts of your worldview. So that's the idea. These are just examples. So to see how these truths can be subversive, it's worth considering the ways in which inquiry can bring value or disvalue. In the first place, we might just directly value knowledge. We might directly value true belief, so that having a true belief is valuable just for its own sake. Now, it looks like inquiry can deliver true beliefs. So in that case, if one of our subversive ideas above were true, and we were to add it to our stock of beliefs, that will in itself just count as a benefit. So, if situationism in psychology is true, and we add that and we believe it, then we benefit in that particular respect. Second, we value a host of other things as well, and learning the truth can be valuable because it can give us more effective strategies for pursuing our other goals. So truth is instrumentally valuable. It's not just valuable in itself, but it's valuable insofar as it will tell me the best means to achieve my goals. So again, subversive truths may well have a value in this respect. But third, inquiry can undermine a set of values or goals. So an inquiry may well lead us to conclude that some goal is unattainable, or it may undermine our justification for valuing that goal. And this is where truths become subversive. They undermine our way of life by undermining the goals that we have previously pursued. Now, a romantic will say that it's this third area where true beliefs can be negative. True beliefs can be a bad thing by undermining the set of goals that have organised our way of life. Gnostics, by contrast, will say that this kind of destabilisation of goals through inquiry will be progressive, because it will lead us to adopt a better set of goals. It will lead us to adopt goals that are more attainable or more worthy of pursuit. Yes, the transition may be painful, but in the long run, the truth will benefit us. Even subversive truths will benefit us by leading us to adopt better goals. So, I mean, once we had the goal of eliminating witchcraft and protecting people from witchcraft, the discovery that there are no witches may well have been painful for some people in witchcraft-related institutions. I suppose it put witch hunters out of a job, but we're now able to devote our energies to goals that don't rest on fantasy and that have a genuine hope of improving society. So that's the sort of the Gnostics' view of this. But again, reflect on the examples that we just saw above. One of the goals that many people have today is that of building a fair, equal society in which nobody is discriminated against on the basis of factors like race and sex. So if we discovered that there really were radical differences between the races, or that societies that contain different races do tend towards disorder or whatever, well, this would undermine what for many people is a central and fundamental project, or at least it could undermine that. So, the Gnostic will want to say that this destabilization of values, if it were to happen, would be progressive, right? What we've discovered is that our goal of equality was not properly justified. Now we can work on constructing goals that are more attainable and that are justifiable by what the facts are. And here the Gnostic may appeal to the instrumental value of truth. After all, if there is a fundamental distinction in the cognitive capacity of the races, wouldn't it be better to know this? If we knew that, then we could stop pursuing impossible ideals, and it would better equip us to implement social policies that work best for everybody. We may end up treating the different races differently, but if different races really do have different capacities, maybe that different treatment is warranted. So, for the Romantic, on the other hand, the question is, what exactly is wrong with pursuing an impossible ideal? What's wrong with having a goal that can't be fulfilled? And if the claim is that the truth is better because it leads to better policies, well, we're yet again just asking what the instrumental value of truth is. So now we're just weighing up whether the consequences of believing the truth will be better than the consequences of believing the falsehood. And there are good reasons to worry about the consequences of believing the truth here. So, first of all, to take the example of scientific racism, so the truth here may have a direct negative consequence on the people who are classed as inferior. Learning that you are a member of the inferior race may lead people to just sort of give up, right? It may lead them to just not bother aiming to achieve anything. After all, if I'm inferior due to my genes, why bother aiming high, right? So in this way, a false belief in equality may promote social improvement by encouraging people to do the best they can, right? If you assume that all the races are equal, then even if they're actually not, even if some do have lower cognitive capacities or whatever, the point is that everybody's going to kind of try equally hard. So I mean that's one way among presumably many in which knowing the truth, if it is a truth, of scientific racism could have a negative consequence on the people who are in the inferior race. Second, we have good reason to expect that these truths would be used to justify oppressive social policies. We know that historically humans have oppressed members of other groups on the grounds of cognitive capacities. And I mean, I say historically, it still goes on today. And, it was only a few generations ago that women were denied the vote and black people were enslaved and so on. Third, the Romantic may suggest that we would lose an organising plan, an organising goal or vision for society. So in this particular case, we would lose the ideal that all people are in some fundamental sense peers, equal collaborators in building the country. So the truth here would negatively affect our vision for the country and perhaps our relationships with others. And I think similar points could perhaps be made for the other subversive truths that we saw. Or I suppose I should say subversive ideas that we saw, because, we're not claiming that any of those are actually true, but just asking us to imagine what we would say if they were true. So, yes, the truth will be instrumentally valuable in some ways, but the Romantic can point to ways in which it's not instrumentally valuable. So that is perhaps a bit of a problem for the Gnostic here. Now, One way that we might try to approach this debate is to consider broader theories of well-being. Philosophers have long debated what exactly well-being consists in, what it is for life to go well for a person. I'll briefly note three of the most popular views and how they relate to the debate between the Gnostics and Romantics. So first of all, there is hedonism. The hedonist says that well-being consists simply in having the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. That's all it takes for life to go well. Pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically good, pain is the only thing that's intrinsically bad. Different hedonists will give different accounts of what exactly pleasure consists in. Some hedonists will say that there are certain types of pleasure that are more significant than others. But either way, it's pretty clear that on this view, truth has no value in itself. And it's not always going to be instrumentally valuable either. If false belief in the afterlife brings people comfort without any significant cost, there's just nothing to be gained by rejecting it. So there's no obvious reason under hedonism to expect subversive truths to always lead to progress. The second account is the desire satisfaction account. The simplest version of this is that a person is better off the more of their desires are fulfilled. So the greater proportion of fulfilled desires you have, the better off you are. One motivation for the desire satisfaction account is cases like this. Suppose that Frank is in what he takes to be a happy marriage. He is very satisfied with his marriage. It brings him great pleasure. He loves his wife, and he believes that his wife loves him. In fact, she hates him and regularly cheats on him. Frank doesn't know this. He dies feeling completely fulfilled. Compare Frank to Vincent. Vincent has exactly the same experiences as Frank, except his experiences, his beliefs rather, are true, because his wife actually does love him. Now, on the hedonist view, there is no difference in Frank and Vincent's well-being. Frank is just as well off as Vincent. And many philosophers have thought that this is implausible. The problem, they will argue, is that Frank desires that his wife loves him, and we can see that this desire is unfulfilled. So what matters is not just how our experiences feel from the inside, it's also important that what we want actually is the case. That it's important that our desires actually be fulfilled, not just that we believe that they're fulfilled. Now, prima facie, this might look like it provides a good basis for Huxley's Credo. The Gnostic wants to say that subversive truths will be progressive, and the desire satisfaction account might seem to accommodate this. Suppose we have various goals which presuppose a falsehood. Imagine somebody who has the goal of communion with God, or gaining entry into heaven, or whatever, even though no God exists. It is impossible for their desire to be satisfied. Now, if they were to adopt a true belief instead, then they would, if they were to come to the belief that God does not exist, then they would abandon their goal of communion with God, and instead they would adopt different goals that actually can be satisfied. So they would probably have a greater proportion of satisfied desires, which means greater well-being on the desire satisfaction account. Well, it's not quite so simple. Here's the problem with this. When somebody has a deep, fundamental desire that cannot be fulfilled, this will involve a host of other desires that can be fulfilled. The person who believes in God does not just desire to commune with God. They will desire to, say, proselytize to other people, or to go to church, or to read the Bible, or to engage in certain ritual activities, and so on. So their belief in God provides a kind of organizing framework for their life, and that will entail a whole bunch of other desires which are fulfillable, and which often do get fulfilled. And it may even make them more able to satisfy the seemingly unrelated desires. So recall the example of Huxley. In deep depression, he was, for a time, unable to continue his work or to maintain his friendships. Now, had he believed in an afterlife, that would have been alleviated. And so it would have enabled him to fulfill those other desires better than he was. Now, if a person comes to accept a subversive truth, and as such loses their sort of organising goal for their life, what reason is there for assuming that they will always develop a better framework with which to replace it? I mean, certainly many religious people will claim that if they were to lose their belief in God, they would just be lost. They wouldn't know what to do with their lives. And I mean, to be fair, it's not as if people can just, commit themselves to new value systems. It's not as though they can just adopt new desires. In the same way as we can't just choose what to believe, it's also, you can't really just choose what to desire or what to value. We don't have that degree of voluntary control over our commitments. So yeah, it's not entirely obvious then that actually holding true beliefs would lead to a greater proportion of satisfied desires. And finally, it's worth noting what I think is kind of an interesting concession of both the hedonist account and the desire satisfaction account. On both of these accounts, insofar as true belief is valuable, it is valuable only instrumentally, only because it provides us with a means of producing pleasure, or a means of satisfying our desires or choosing satisfiable desires. But we might think that this is just completely at odds with Huxley's credo from the start. After all, on these views, it's not that, as Huxley put it, truth is better than much profit. Rather, the proposal would be that truth is required in order to achieve much profit, right? Where profit is pleasure or desire satisfaction. Now, even if true belief can play this role, I mean, true belief can play that role, but that seems to miss Huxley's point somewhat, because it seems like Huxley was prepared to grant that true belief can bring discomfort, that true belief can lead to unsatisfied desires, but he wanted to say it's better anyway. So it's not really clear that, even if we were to get the view from these two theories of well-being, even if either of these theories was to allow us to defend the view that subversive truths will always be progressive and that they will lead to better kind of goal systems, it's not obvious that it really connects with what was motivating Huxley. So, third, there is objective list theory. Objective list theory is designed to deal with cases like this. Let's say Martha desires to count blades of grass. She gets a great deal of pleasure from doing this. She's interested in nothing else. She just occupies herself by counting blades of grass. Her life is pleasurable and her desires are satisfied, but intuitively something is missing. And according to the objective list theory, some things are good for us. Some things are worth wanting, regardless of whether we actually desire them. So Martha would be better off if she spent her time cultivating friendships, viewing artworks, pursuing creative hobbies, and so on, rather than just counting blades of grass. Basically, not all desires are equal, right? Martha would be better off with better desires. So the objective list theorist will just kind of give a list of things that are supposed to be objectively good, that just form part of our well-being, regardless of whether it brings us any particular pleasure or whether we desire it. It's a theory, I guess, of what we ought to desire. The question is then going to be, well, what goes on the list of things that are supposed to be objectively valuable? Well, the Gnostic will presumably want to add true belief to the list. True belief is in itself intrinsically valuable. This looks like it gets at the spirit of Huxley's credo. But the Romantic is still going to object here. Well, what if the list contains things that would be undermined by true belief? To take one of the examples given earlier, suppose that stable relationships require people to believe myths about themselves, but that stable relationships are objectively good for us. In that case, there's at least a tension, and it's not obvious that true belief will always win out. Similarly, I guess maybe more realistically, the Romantic might say, well, look, there are ways in which religious beliefs help, promote community or help give people a sense of purpose in their lives, helps give people a sense that they're acting for something greater than themselves, etc. Again, there's a tension between the true belief and the other things that are cited as being objectively valuable. And there's no obvious reason why true belief would win out, would always be favoured. Okay, so This has been a very, very brief overview of theories of well-being, but from those are the three main theories in the literature: hedonism, desire satisfaction, and objective list. And just from our brief look at them, it does appear that none of these theories provide any obvious justification for Huxley's credo, even in its more sophisticated form. On none of these theories is it obvious that subversive truths will lead us to embrace better goals. Or better values. And there may well be ways of justifying Huxley's credo from one of these theories, but it would require a more careful argument. Again, this is just a starting point for discussion. Okay then, so there is a further objection to Huxley's credo. An assumption behind both the Gnostic and the Romantic position, as we've discussed them so far. An assumption behind both of them is that scientific inquiry aims for and generally achieves true belief. So then the Gnostic will defend the universal value of inquiry, while the Romantic sometimes questions it. But it's not actually clear that this assumption is true. I won't go into this point in too much detail here, because it's an enormous debate. I have numerous videos on it. But there are many philosophers who will say, actually, scientific theories, even in ideal circumstances, do not provide true descriptions of the world, but instead they're doing something else. So one view would be that scientific theories are just useful tools for systematizing, predicting, and controlling observable phenomena. You check out my videos on scientific realism for more on this debate. But consider Newtonian mechanics. This is one of the most powerful theories we've ever developed. To this day, we still use Newtonian mechanics when trying to work out how to send probes to Pluto. But it turns out Newtonian mechanics is basically completely wrong in terms of its description of the underlying structure of space-time. It has since been superseded by general relativity, but we still use Newtonian mechanics because the computations are a lot simpler. It makes the right predictions for, or at least it makes approximately accurate predictions for the behaviour of mid-sized objects within a certain range of velocities. So, we go with this because it's simpler and because it works well enough, basically. But now, turn the clock back to the 18th century. So, when Newtonian mechanics was still in its infancy, still being developed, scientists at the time who took Newtonian mechanics to provide a true description of reality, well, they therefore had false beliefs. But surely they were better off with these false beliefs, weren't they? I mean, if they had been informed of various facts concerning general relativity, such as the facts about gravitational time dilation, it's unlikely that this would have been of any practical use to them. Indeed, it's not clear that they would even have been able to understand what they were being told. In order to make sense of a theory like general relativity, and in order to apply it in deriving useful predictions, you need a certain degree of conceptual and technological development. So you need to have mathematical concepts like the Lorentzian manifold. You need to have the right kind of instruments to check the predictions, things which didn't exist back in the 18th century. Newtonian mechanics allowed the construction of very accurate predictive models. It allowed the unification of a diverse range of phenomena. Under Newtonian mechanics, you can capture things like not only the orbits of the planets, but also, the swing of a pendulum, right? Apparently, like, those seem like, at least initially, like they're completely different things. But under Newtonian mechanics, you can capture them under a simple set of laws. And it was intelligible to scientists at the time. So in this way, it was an enormously productive falsehood. So the truth, then, is not necessarily even of any instrumental value. Like I said, to this day, we still use Newtonian mechanics in many engineering contexts. This point, I think, becomes especially pressing when we consider that we might be in the same kind of position as scientists of the past. Just as we can find enormously successful theories in the past that turned out to be false, perhaps many of our best theories will turn out to be false as well. This is a more sceptical view of science, and it, I think, poses a further problem for the Gnostic who defends Huxley's credo, because the Gnostic wants to say, well, truth is better, even if it destabilises our values. Even if it destabilises our goals, because in that case we'll be able to develop better goals that actually are achievable. So, that's why we should aim for the truth. But then the skeptic says, well, hey, it turns out that the truth itself is often beyond our grasp, in which case the Gnostic's goal of achieving the truth has been undermined. because the Gnostic presupposes that the truth is achievable. So, in terms of Huxley's Credo, that truth is better than much profit, a skeptic will say, well, we don't have good grounds for assuming that we have ever achieved the truth, or at least there is, our ability to achieve the truth is significantly limited. Even if we were to acquire overwhelming empirical evidence for some subversive proposition, well, it still might turn out to be false, just as Newtonian mechanics turned out to be false. So profit, as in utility, whether it be predictive utility of a theory or the impact on human life of the technological applications or whatever, profit is all we ever have available. Then the question then, when we're faced with some new potentially subversive theory, is just whether the profit of accepting the subversive theory is greater than the profit of rejecting it. So that's maybe one challenge. I suppose that to some degree the Gnostic might just accept this. The Gnostic might say, well, look, we should always aim for the truth. If the skeptic is right, if it's true that we are unjustified in believing that our best theories provide correct descriptions of the world, well, that would just be one of those subversive truths. It would just be one of those truths that challenges some fundamental part of our worldview. So there's no challenge to Huxley's Credo here. Now, I think that, this point is fair enough, but it kind of misses what I think is perhaps the point of the criticism. So the thing is, these theories, like Newtonian mechanics, are extremely valuable to us. And they have a great variety of virtues, and it's worthwhile pursuing them. Now, if we claim that they fail to achieve the truth, right? If the truth is inaccessible to us in these contexts, so that even theories which have the virtues of predictive accuracy, simplicity, elegance, explanatory scope, useful technological applications, and so on, if even those theories fail to achieve the truth, then why should we think that the truth is even worth wanting, right? What's so special about it, I suppose? Like, we can say what's so special about theories that exhibit predictive power, explanatory scope, technological applications, but if even they aren't true, then the skeptic may well wonder why this is something that we're putting so much... Why would we put so much value on this inaccessible truth? Okay, so those were some challenges to Huxley's Credo. Now, before we end, I do want to address what I suppose is an important criticism of at least the Romantic position. The Romantic denies that true belief is always better. So the Romantic says there are circumstances in which people are better off believing falsehoods, or that perhaps society as a whole is better off without the subversive truths. The concern is that this kind of position will be used to justify censorship. Indeed, this sort of Romantic argument has been made many times in the past when subversive truths were proposed to justify censorship. Just look at the response to Galileo and Darwin. I mean, to this day, actually, there are people who resist educating children about the facts of our evolutionary history because what they see as the subversive nature of the truth, or the truth is subversive to their worldview. Now, the important thing to note about this is that, as we stated at the beginning, the Romantic position is only a claim about value. To say that somebody is better off not knowing the truth is not to say that they ought to give up their true belief, nor is it to say that people ought not to engage in particular areas of inquiry. It is clearly possible to endorse the Romantic position while still opposing censorship. Now, Kitcher, in his discussion of this point, notes that there are two reasons why, even from a Romantic point of view, censorship would, he thinks, be pointless. So, first, the problem with attempting to ban particular areas of inquiry is that subversive truths often come from unexpected sources. Heliocentrism arose from the attempts to reform the church calendar. Darwinism arose from attempts to catalogue the flora and fauna of the world. It is only when these subversive ideas have actually been proposed and have been motivated by the evidence, it's only when these subversive ideas become live possibilities that people recognise their destabilising potential. There would be little point trying to control inquiry to prevent subversive ideas from being proposed, because nobody has any idea beforehand where the subversive ideas will come from. Second point that Kitcher makes is that if we can foresee that some area of inquiry might pose a threat to our values, then the damage is already done. So what Kitcher says is, look, suppose we're pursuing some goal X, right? But we're then worried that an inquiry might show that X is unobtainable. So, to avoid destabilising our society, we propose a ban on that area of inquiry. So we can imagine somebody saying that we should avoid studying population genetics because they're concerned that it might justify scientific racism and thereby undermine our pursuit of political equality. The problem is that by identifying this area of inquiry that poses a threat to our values, we are already doubting the presuppositions of those values. If population genetics could pose a threat to political equality, we're already assuming that political equality rests on questionable assumptions, and that already undermines it as a central and important project. Part of the reason for this is due to the tight connection between belief and truth, right? It wouldn't make sense for somebody to say, I believe that P, but P isn't true. That would strike us as absurd, right? To say something like that. To believe that P is to believe that P is true. So once doubts arise as to P's truth, right? Once we can no longer take P's truth for granted, once it's a live possibility that P might be false, then we've already lost some of the grounds for believing that P. If we're taking seriously the idea, or if we're kind of open to the idea that P is false, right? Then we're losing some of the grounds for believing it. And the best we can hope for at that point is that inquiry will resolve these doubts. So Kitcher thinks that actually, even if you're a romantic, there's not going to be good grounds for censoring inquiry. And so that is not something that we should take to be a problematic consequence of the romantic position. Well, okay then, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. Goodbye.